deterrence side in particular. Fourth, and is obviously the role of the Chinese military and computer network operations. Now, a lot of my thinking about this, I've talked about this with various congressional testimony and so on and so forth, and a lot of it deals with the intrusion set and capabilities. But I would just say that what's interesting to me in terms of 2025 is the extent to which I've already seen an expansion of the discussion of the target sets for both computer network exploit and computer network attack activities to go beyond the Taiwan scenario, to go beyond US military intervention, and to encompass a much wider range of countries and regions, frankly, in line with the new historic missions as articulated by Hu Jintao and others, and I'm sure Marianne will talk more about that. And then finally, I just want to highlight that whereas our short-term interest in this issue has been the cyber espionage, and our medium-term interest has been the computer network attack scenario involving Taiwan, that there's a series of much more profound long-term issues that we're going to be confronting out to 2025 in the cyber arena. The first is supply chain. There's really been a revolution in this town in a lot of people's minds about computer network defense and cyberspace defense in the following sense, that no one that is serious on the topic anymore believes that you can build technologies or build systems where perimeter defense is possible any longer. Instead, we have to operate, mainly because of the introduction of foreign componentry from China and other places, and foreign software and back office coding being done in Bangalore and Beijing and all these other places. You have to assume in your network, as I do in mine, that componentry and software in that network is potentially malicious, and that you have to nonetheless be able to operate the network effectively. You can't simply take it offline, but that we have to operate as if perimeter defense is impossible, and we have to do defense in depth within the network. There's a bunch of other, the other implication obviously for supply chain that has been much more uncomfortable for companies and for governments to deal with is that we're going to have to spend a hell of a lot more money on code and hardware auditing than we ever have in the past. And that people at the C-level have to understand that that's a major expense. It's very difficult to do, it's very time consuming, it's very expensive, and not 100% foolproof, but they're going to have to spend a lot of money on it. The second set of longer term issues really deals with CFIUS, and infrastructure. If I had a Chinese trade official in front of me right now, I'd say go for some low-hanging fruit, please. Have high R by Whirlpool. Something where it says incontrovertibly that there is, somebody somewhere will find a national security justification for it. But, the vast majority of people will say the sale of Whirlpool to the Chinese does not constitute a threat to U.S. national security. Inure the American public to the idea that the Chinese are going to be buying assets in the United States. But instead, we get Huawei 3Com, where the entire U.S. government comes up in one gigantic paroxysm about Huawei. And now the Chinese are, of course, in their defensive crouch. This is racist. This is xenophobic. No, it's Huawei. It's not xenophobia. It's Huawei, and whose sins are well known. Similarly, on infrastructure, it's not just buying companies, but it's also buying submarine cable backbone. I mean, Huawei now, through the purchase of Global Marine, has 40% of the cable laying ships in the world. So when you start thinking about information security broadly defined in terms of who owns submarine cable backbone in the Western Pacific and things like that, these are much broader issues, much more long-term issues. And then even farthest out in terms of long-term, and I'll stop here, is that unlike the United States, the Chinese actually have a very focused, dedicated, coordinated national strategy with bureaucracies and meetings and everything about internet governance and IT standards. For a long time in the United States, we say, oh, Verizon will take care of that, or Cisco will go to that meeting, that IEEE meeting. We don't have to send anybody to that meeting. But in fact, what we find is a very coordinated Chinese government effort on this front. Then the IT standards is probably the biggest threat potentially of them all, because China simply did not want to pay royalties to Irwin Jacobs and other people, and said, we're just going to develop our own inferior Chinese IT standards for every possible protocol, and then use our own market access as leverage to force the companies that build componentry and export them out of China to have to make them compatible with our IT protocols. In some cases, those involving security, like this WAPI phenomena, which was the Chinese replacement for 802.11, which was rejected by IEEE, rejected by the International Standards Organization, but nonetheless keeps rearing its head And here's the list of 11 or 50 Chinese joint venture companies with whom you have to partner, all of whom have some linkages to the Ministry of State Security. And oh, by the way, you have to give over all of your cryptography source code to them because they will build the APIs for your technology. And you're sort of thinking to yourself, okay, I sent, again, it's a perfect example of how the Chinese, for their own economic development purposes, use market access as leverage to be able to turn the innovation ladder on its head. But in the IT area in particular, when you look at the protocol level, the very utility and plumbing of the internet, we're looking at changes over the next 10 to 15 years, in particular Chinese leadership on IPv6, which is the next generation internet, where our lack of a strategy and our lack of coordinated bureaucratic action could ultimately be of much greater harm to us in the cyberspace arena than anything that's come before. Let me stop there.
Thank you. My name is Marianne Kiblahan-Wise. I'm from the Center for Naval Analyses, and I'd like to thank Project 2049 and the Council on Foreign Relations for inviting me to participate in today's events. I know time is brief. Randy had asked me to look at factors and trends currently in place in China that will affect how China may behave in the future in the maritime domain. There's 3 points I want to make. First, I would argue that for PRC leaders, establishing and maintaining strength in the maritime domain bolsters China's